In today's video, we're going to talk about how dividends are calculated for the validators in the Bittensor network. Dividends are the way that emissions are calculated for the validators. And so in Taostats, you can see that we've got a dividends column over here. In previous videos where I've walked through how emissions are calculated, I just said, well, we use the dividends and then move on. But in this video, we're actually going to walk through where this number comes from and how it's calculated for each validator in each subnet. But before we get to that, let's just do a quick review of subnet emissions in the Bittensor network. We've got 32 subnets, and inside the root subnet, a allocation is determined for each of the subnets. And so in this case, subnet 8 gets 10%. Inside each subnet, that 10% of 1 tau every 12 seconds is distributed amongst the validators, the miners, the subnet owner, and those that delegate tau. The breakdown is 18% for subnet owners, for miners, 41% for validators. That 41% for validators is then broken up by the dividend as to figure out the allocation for each one of the validators. The dividend column is going to add up to 1 for all of the validators. So I like to think of this as a percentage, 23.7%, 12.3%, and so on. So if you take the amount of tau for the subnet allocated to the validators and multiply it by this percentage, you get the emission for each one of the validators. The dividend is calculated by taking the amount of stake that each of the validators has delegated to them and the Vtrust. So let's walk through how that works. When you're a validator, people delegate tau to your validator, and that increases the amount of emission. You then return part of your emissions to all of the validators. And in Taostats, you can see that on the validator page. You can see the in 24 hours, for 1,000 tau, every nominator gets this much. So if you were using Taostats, you would be at 0.469 tau for every 1,000 tau you have delegated to Taostats in 24 hours. So as a validator, to maximize your emission, you need a high amount of stake. And some of the subnets require at least 20,000 stake to even become an active validator. And then you also want to maximize your Vtrust. So what's Vtrust? Let's get into that really quickly. If we think about the task of a validator inside a subnet, is they are testing all of the miners to make sure that they are following the incentive mechanism for the subnet. And every epoch, the validators place weights, grading the miners from 1 to 256, or however many miners are in the subnet. And the higher miners get higher emission, the lower miners get lower emission. As part of the checks and balances of the Bittensor network, we also look at the weights that the validators are placing. So every epoch, the validators place weights, and we get this giant two-dimensional matrix of all of the weights for all of the miners from all of the validators. We can chart those. And you can see here that these validators all sort of match the consensus. They're all in that range, right? This one's a little out, but they're all pretty close. But this one up here doesn't fit the narrative. And this is probably not on purpose, right? There's probably just an issue with the validator. Maybe it's using an old version of the code. Maybe it went down for a little bit. But it's clearly not in consensus. But when a validator is not in consensus, it gets penalized on its Vtrust. And so the Vtrust of this validator is going to be decreased. We can see that. We can pull that right from the chain. And we can see that the Vtrust for 103 validator is 81%, whereas the one at 107, probably this one right here, is at 97.5%. So it's a different subnet with a similar Vtrust issue. If we look at this validator in position 9, 268,000 staked, but a 47% Vtrust. If we look at the one right above it, similar amount of stake, the Vtrust is about double. And if we come over here, we can see the dividends are about doubled. Therefore, the emissions are about doubled. So this validator is not doing as well as they could. If their Vtrusts were higher, they could almost double their emissions. You can look at the other way as well. If we look down here at 11, 11 has about half the stake, but double the Vtrust. And if we look at the dividends and the emissions, they're about the same. So having that low Vtrust has a profound effect on the amount of emissions that your validator is creating. If you were a validator and you wanted to see this, you could build charts for each of the subnets you're validating in. We can see obviously a big drop in Vtrust here. We can also see a large difference between the stake and dividend. And in general, if your Vtrust is high, your stake and your dividend, the percent of total stake should be pretty close to the percent of total dividend. We can see here that their dividend is significantly lower than the amount of stake, where everybody else is just about spot on. And then if you graph the difference, you can see this large delta here. So if you are a validator, you could build charts like this to see the difference and make sure that if you start to get out of consensus, you can go figure out what the problem is and then bring your validator back in consensus to not only increase your emissions, but to also ensure that you're providing the best return for those that have delegated tau to your validator. So quick walkthrough through how dividends work for the validators. Subscribe to this channel for more videos about the Bittensor network. And of course, if you have questions about the data, head over to Tau Stats because that's the place to find it.